Hello, welcome to the LRB. I'm Steve Miller, and with me here is Marc Shovers, a senior legislative attorney. Marc, you were a co-author with Peter Grant of this constitutional highlight on the title of private bills, which is a constitutional requirement in Article 4, Section 8. Tell us a little bit about why that's in the Constitution.
Well, the history of this provision has its genesis in the 19th century, when the volume of issues that the legislature was facing was increasing, and because of that, commerce was growing, the state was getting bigger, there was a lot more legislation that was being passed. And what was happening is that even though there was a lot more legislation being passed, most of the legislation was private and local bills that related to a particular person, place, or thing. And the legislature was not spending its time dealing with issues of statewide concern.
And so this provision helps the legislature stay focused on general issues.
Right. The main purpose of this provision is to require that private and local bills, those that deal with individuals, places, or things, are dealt with in single subject legislation that's clearly identified in the title. So the title will identify to the legislature that that's the topic of the bill. And some of the reasons that this was put in was to eliminate favoritism and discrimination, and to just try and force the legislature to focus on matters of statewide concern. This provision is also closely tied to another constitutional provision in Article 4, Section 31, which prohibits special and private legislation on 9 specific topics, such as prohibits the legislature from granting a divorce or for granting special rules that apply to the imposition or collection of taxes that would affect just one person.
So how has the Supreme Court dealt with this section?
Well, there are 2 main tests that the Supreme Court uses to determine whether legislation is private and local to the extent that it would run afoul of this constitutional provision. The first test is called the Milwaukee Brewers test, not surprisingly, because it deals with a case that involved Milwaukee Brewers. And in that case, the court said that legislation that is private or local runs afoul of this provision if it's in a multi-subject bill like the state budget, which contains hundreds of different topics, unless the issue deals with a statewide concern and a matter that has a statewide dimension, and it would have an immediate effect on the statewide issue. The other way that the court has dealt with it is in a case called the Brookfield case, and that dealt with the city of Brookfield. And in that case, the court said that if legislation is not specific, but that it dealt with a particular class, like a first-class city, for example, the legislation would, again, run afoul of the constitutional provision unless 5 specific tests were met. And those tests include things like the classification is open to the addition of other members, the characteristics of the class are so different that substantially different treatment of members of the class is justified, and that the classification is germane to the purposes of the law.
Okay. And those cases have been fairly recent, I guess.
Right. I believe they're both from the 80s.
So if the legislature wants to deal with this topic and it thinks that it might violate this section of the Constitution, are there any strategies that the legislature can adopt to pass the bill?
Well, there's a number of things that the legislature could do. I mean, the first and easiest would be to just enact it as single subject legislation, where the subject is clearly identified in the title. If for some reason the legislature decides that it really wants to have it be part of a multi-subject bill like the budget bill, one thing they could do is try and modify the topic a little bit so that it is an issue of statewide concern that has a statewide impact and has an immediate effect on a statewide concern. And they would also have to make sure that the 5 components of the Brookfield test are met.
Okay. Well, if you want to learn more, you can look at the constitutional highlight, which is on the LRB website. Thank you, Marc.
It was my pleasure.
And thank you for watching the podcast.